Good morning, this is John Hegler talking to you from Columbus, Ohio. This is my third and last talk about the U.S. budget deficit and related topics. Previously, I had established that annual government revenues are running about $800 billion short of optimum and that the country is spending about $1.7 trillion more than it should be. I suggested these numbers by drawing on the positive experience of the four-year period of time of 1998 to 2001, in which a country experienced 4 consecutive annual budget surpluses, the only surpluses since the 1950s. Today I'm going to continue my discussion of the federal tax revenues by noting some areas of the tax code that lack logic, as well as making some observations and suggestions with regard to revenues. I'll then discuss some ideas on reducing government outlays or not, and then finally I'll conclude by discussing the government's process in addressing the problem of our out-of-control budget deficits. First item is that proposed taxes on unrealized gains for taxpayers with net worths in excess of $100 million lacks logic. What about the taxpayer with a net worth of only $95 million, that poor soul? Seems close to $100 million. Most taxpayers have unrealized gains if they are homeowners or investors in real estate. Why should not everyone be subject to this ridiculous tax? It is discriminatory at its core and impossible to police. If enacted, it would undoubtedly give rise to a vast new industry of high-paid consultants assisting very wealthy people on how not to pay the tax. This tax will never happen. Next, there is a pass-through deduction of up to 20% of income related to pass-through entities, such as sub-S corps, partnerships, and Schedule C taxpayers. This lacks logic. Why should the net income from rental properties be taxed any differently than W-2 income, for instance? If you would have a doctor who's a Schedule C taxpayer making $200,000 a year, he would be paying a lesser tax on his income than the employee, doctor that's employed by our larger entity making $200,000. So it just doesn't make any sense. Next, there is a tax on corporate buybacks equal to 1% of the buyback amount. This seems to lack logic, but I guess it is okay if the government wants to take a cut of a profitable buyback transaction. The profit part of the transaction to the corporation is in the reduction in share count and resulting increase in earnings per share. If the buyback tax were increased, as has been discussed, the practice of buybacks will likely decrease. The offset would be that corporations will use their tax excess cash flow to increase dividends paid to shareholders as opposed to buying back stock. As an investment advisor, I'm all in for higher dividends. Next, there is a tax provision called the stepped-up basis rule, which lacks logic. Currently, it is tax efficient to die with significantly appreciated property. And that is because that the property to the beneficiary, the tax basis of the property to the beneficiary becomes the market value of the property at the time of death. So the end result is that the family unit will legally avoid taxation on the appreciation of the property forever. Next, I'd like to discuss the curious case of the waived minimum required distribution for retirement accounts for the tax year 2020. That was the COVID year, so in a panic, the government waived MRDs. For many multimillionaire taxpayers, the MRD is a significant component of that taxpayer's taxable income. So by removing that taxable item, many of those multimillionaires' income fell below the minimum income threshold that would qualify them for stimulus checks. Remember those? So taxpayers with net worths well in excess of $5 million began to receive stimulus checks in the same year that their stock market gains were plentiful. Is this a great country or what? Next, I would eliminate tax credit giveaways that lack logic. For instance, electric vehicles and solar panel tax credits are good examples of the government subsidizing industries that should stand on their own merits solely due to the quality and cost effectiveness of their products. So next, I'd like to discuss some revenue generating ideas. And one that caught my attention is what I would call, let's find the tax evaders. I have in my possession a 2021 article with the headline, "The Top 1% Dodge $163 billion in Annual Taxes," according to the Department of the Treasury. The article continued with the statement that the estimate widens the tax gap, the shortfall between what's owed and collected, to $600 billion per year. Since one major part of my whole discussion revolves around the idea that the country is running short about $800 billion a year in revenues, the article deserves some special attention, since the solution to the government's revenue shortfall may lie in this particular article. The government seems to have a very specific amount in mind and seems to give off the impression that they know where the money is. It is in the billionaire class, of which there are approximately 750 in the country. If the IRS only had more money and resources, they can find all of those evaders. The IRS is a vast organization with high-level, very competent human assets. I say, let's bring that money in. What are we waiting for? Qualified dividends and long-term capital gains are generally tax advantaged. Taxpayers in a tax bracket lower than 22% pay no tax, and most others pay a tax of about 15%. I would suggest that the tax rate on dividends and long-term capital gains could be increased as long as a recommended reduction in the corporate income tax rate, as previously discussed, goes into effect. Dividend income and capital gains would explode in this country. No one is going to care about paying a little bit more. But of course, I would propose to exempt all bald-headed investment advisors from any sort of capital gains increase. Next topic is the taxation of Social Security income. There's two things to discuss here. First is the initial treatment of Social Security withheld from wages is treated differently from 401k withholdings. 401k withholdings are not included in taxable income in the year contributed. For example, if you had a $100,000 W-2 and $10,000 in a 401k contribution, your net taxable is $90,000. However, the tax treatment for Social Security contributions does not match up to the 401k treatment. For example, $100,000 in a W-2, you would have $6,200 in Social Security withheld, but you would pay tax on the full $100,000. This lacks logic in that I would suggest that the tax treatment of both 401ks and Social Security withholdings be equal. And the next Social Security subject is currently taxed to the extent of 85% of Social Security income. Some politicians have advocated for making Social Security non-taxable with an estimated annual cost to the Treasury of $95 billion per year. I note that Social Security is already non-taxable for many Social Security recipients whose other sources of income are not substantial. The idea of eliminating the tax on Social Security will be biased to benefit taxpayers of significant net worths. As a hypothetical example, a 73-year-old retiree required to take $110,000 of minimum required distribution in 2024, which is based on approximately $3 million in his retirement accounts, would not only benefit by not paying tax on his Social Security, he would have a secondary benefit in that a significant portion of the $110,000 minimum required distribution that would have been taxed at a rate of 22% would now drop down into the 12% bracket. And just a short comment about the quote unquote other revenues section of the federal revenues. This line item comprises about 5% of the totals of the government's total tax take, and it's a mishmash of revenue sources, things like estate taxes, tariffs, excise taxes, etc., royalties. I'll pass on the subject of tariffs, as I don't really have a lot of insight or particular expertise in this area. I would propose that monetization of the country's vast real estate assets that for the most part are currently untapped. One example would be Anwar, the world's largest untapped oil reserve located in Alaska. This asset just sits there while Saudi Arabia has monetized their largest asset by bringing the state-owned oil company, Aramco, public. The United States could do the same if we would so choose. And recently, a massive lithium deposit was discovered in Arkansas. That's just a few days ago. So it is so recent that I am not yet certain if it is on federal land. But a brief press release stated that Arkansas may be the home to a vast resource that could reshape the world's energy needs. There seems to be some excellent revenue-raising opportunities in fact situations such as these. That includes my comments about revenues. Let me emphasize what an enormous task would be to raise revenues by a staggering $800 billion per year. People become unhappy when they have to pay more taxes. There's about 5 places in my comments where my own household would be paying a little bit more. Don't tell that to my wife. I don't want to come home from the golf course someday and find all the locks have been changed. I would then counter her displeasure by explaining to her that our dividend checks are getting quite large, as well as our capital gains. Next, I'd like to discuss the subject of government outlays, which are approximately $6.8 trillion per year. I've got a worksheet that really capsulizes our outlays into 6 line items: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on the national debt, defense spending, and all other. So you take the first 5 line items, and all other could be 1,000 sub-line items below that as a subset. The largest items, let's go right to the largest items. Interest on a national debt. Nothing can be changed here because that is the only line item of expenditure that where there's really not any control of. The only controls you have is to limit the amount of debt in the long run, and the other variable is the interest rates that the government has to pay on government debt. So that's determined by the market. At some point in time, if our deficits continue to expand along with government debt, we may have a lack of buyers for our government debt, which would drive up interest rates. Next, I would talk about military. $830 billion a year here. The country is spending about $830 billion per year. The country should engage the world's greatest management consultants to analyze the operations of the military. The objective should be to streamline operations, reducing redundant headcounts and overseas bases, while at the same time maintaining the overall effectiveness of our military. Cutting the military budget by 1/3 would be a good start. Next would be Social Security. This is our second largest line item. People say we can't touch it. I'm a Social Security recipient myself. Well, I guess what I'm going to say doesn't apply to me, but we should immediately increase the retirement age by 2 to 3 years. If, as the political establishment suggests, this were done far out into the future, say 10 years, there would be no effect on the budget during the intervening years. And lastly, the item of the cost of running the government. This is running about $2 trillion a year. Beneath that $2 trillion probably lies thousands of line items, government programs of every shape and size. We need to cut this line item in half. Elon Musk has been discussed as a possible candidate to head a government efficiency commission. Let me just say one thing about one of Mr. Musk's recent feats. He sent a rocket ship 3 times as large as the Eiffel Tower into space at 16,000 miles an hour, and he brought it down back to Earth, put it into first gear, and then parallel parked it into a round cylinder. This is a very talented individual. We need some people like this who can get things done. And our government couldn't. He's done things that our government can't even do. So headcount reductions in the cost of our government should be transitions into the private sector to participate into the unprecedented economic boom initiated by my suggested corporate tax cuts. And I'd like to conclude by a discussion of the major points that we've discussed in all three of our sessions without getting specific numbers and statistics. I'd like to discuss the overall approach to the problem, the process. I have to tell you, the more I dug into the financial mess that our country is in, the more I appreciated the absolute enormity of the situation. Back in session 1, I stated that the key to solving the problem is to throw out the existing playbook that has failed us for long and adjust our thinking. If the process has failed us, then we need to change the process. I liken the problem to an addiction. If an alcoholic is earnestly working to fix his problem, he wants to change his lifestyle, the day will eventually come when the alcoholic hits absolute bottom. Then all the dysfunctional behavior finally gets into the rearview mirror and the directional arrow finally reverses direction. Same thing with the mess of our out-of-control deficits. The country is currently stricken with a disease that I will name deficitism, and we as a country have not yet hit bottom. The legendary stock market technician Joe Granville once stated that every movement starts with one small step. I think it applies here. That one small step could be, in one day it is decided that A, there will be no more tax cuts for any reason, B, there will be no more tax credits given for any reason, any new tax credits, 3, there will be no expansion of any existing tax credits under any circumstance. And finally, there will be a moratorium on new spending programs with no exceptions. And then I would add in one final action, and that would be to find some government program somewhere, regardless of size, and eliminate it completely. Collectively then, one small step has been taken. Maybe we can then move the needle in the right direction. Then after that one small step is taken, the government needs to start to think big. I note that in President Biden's tax hike proposal announced earlier this year, he called for $3 trillion in new taxes over 10 years. Well, while the amount of $3 trillion sounds like a lot of money to us mere mortals, I would point out that it is only $300 billion per year, which doesn't move the needle in a $2 trillion budget deficit. The amount will hardly cover the projected increases in just 2 line items, Social Security and interest on the national debt. And finally, I would suggest that Santa Claus need not be a part of the political process. His activities should be limited to Christmas Eve. The only way to get away from the Santa Claus effect, a law needs to be enacted that requires the U.S. budget to be balanced, or else it will never get accomplished. Perhaps some future financial crisis might occur that is directly caused by the financial irresponsibility that leads to some sort of budgetary restraint. Frankly, I hope we don't have to address a problem in reaction to a crisis. We should do better. Well, that's it. I'm officially retiring from the business of presenting webcasts. It's been fun.